So my name is Dominik Brunner. I'm from EMPA in Switzerland, and Corinna Keller is there in person. I suppose you have met her. I'm sorry that I cannot be there. I was planning to join as well, but we have 4 people leaving our institute today, and somebody has to give the farewell speech, and so that was me. But I'm happy to give a brief introduction to the topic that will be covered in this exercise. So I guess most of you know that air pollution affects human health, ecosystems, agricultural production. It affects respiratory and cardiovascular health. It causes about 7 million premature deaths annually, according to estimates of WHO, and roughly 200,000 in Europe. It also affects ecosystems through acidification, eutrophication, oxidative damage, affects plant growth and crop production, and it causes a high external costs, so health costs of the order of 600 billion euros in Europe in 2017. So that's really high costs that are caused by air pollution. And so it's also in an economic perspective valuable to reduce air pollution. And actually, we in Europe, we have been able to reduce air pollution, improve air quality. I'm just showing a few figures here on the right, showing trends of nitrogen dioxide, PM2.5, and ozone in Switzerland. You can see that for these primary air pollutants and NO2, we have quite substantial downward trends. The different lines are different stations in Switzerland, from rural to urban stations. And the black dashed line is the legal threshold we have in Switzerland. So nowadays, in 2024-5, most of the stations in Switzerland are compliant with these regulations. Also, PM2.5 pollution has improved. And the situation is quite different for ozone, where we have kind of a stabilization over the last years. Now there's new regulations or recommendations by WHO for new air quality guidelines, limits, which are these red lines. And you see that despite the improvements, we are still above those new recommended limits. So I'm trying to go over a little bit fast, so I'm sorry for that, but we have limited time in this exercise. So if you want to simulate air pollution with ICANART, we start here at the bottom with different emissions. We have biogenic emissions of volatile organics from plants treated with the MEGAN scheme. We have natural emissions, probably you've heard in previous exercise about dust and sea salt emissions. And as you will learn in this exercise, anthropogenic emissions dealt with the online emission module. I give some more details about that in a moment. Now, once we have these emissions put into the model, we need to transport the traces and then also account for gas phase chemistry, which is also part of this exercise. You will learn a little bit more about this gas phase chemistry, but then also aerosols and interactions between gases and aerosols. And then finally, there's also deposition and other processes that need to be accounted for. But this exercise will focus on how we get emissions into the model and how we deal with them, the chemistry, gas phase chemistry in the model. Now, to incorporate anthropogenic emissions into the model, we use here in this exercise the so-called online emissions module, which we have developed at EMPA for a previous model called COSMO. What it essentially does, it reads in emissions per sector and then applies different temporal and vertical scalings to these emissions for each hour of the day, for the different days of the week, so different emissions on weekends than on weekdays, and also seasonally varying emissions. An alternative, we can also provide emission timings for each hour of a year. And OEM, this module, has been integrated into ICANART with these features, but we also implemented some other features that we will not discuss here in this exercise. So the OEM module essentially consists of several Fortran routines that have been added to ART. These are all called MOART OEM, And then there's a types, which defines the OEM data types, the init, which initializes those data sets, allocates the memory, but also reads the input files. And I'll come back to that in a minute. And then the essential part is the OEM emissions routine, which applies these vertical and temporal scalings to the emissions. OEM requires a set of input files. The first one is the gridded emissions, the emissions on the icon grid, and the emissions are provided for the different species. So, for instance, for NOx, but also for different sectors separately. And then we also can provide country masks to be able to apply different temporal and vertical scalings in different countries. Then we need to provide temporal scaling factors, which are provided also as netCDF file, which describe the day of week, hour of day, and month of year variability of emissions. And another file describing vertical profiles specific for the different emission categories. So that's the input files. And to produce the input files, there's a there's a Python tool called EMIPROC, which we also developed at EMPA and that we will apply in this exercise. What it does, it can take different types of emission inventories. Maybe you have heard of Acad, which is a global emission inventory, and it can produce output for different types of for different models like ICON, but also for WRF by mapping or regridding the original inventory to the model grid. It does this in a conservative way so that we don't lose emissions. It can also merge different inventories. You may have a national inventory for one country and a European inventory for the remaining countries. And it can also apply speciation. So how are emissions from traffic distributed over different VOC species, for instance. And finally, the most important thing, it generates the input files that are needed for OEM. And yeah, here's just an example of an input grid, and then we can map it onto the icon grid for this model domain. Here's just a workflow of the EMIPROC Python tool. So this is the tool here. And we need a number of input files, the emission inventory, for instance, the Acad, the temporal scaling factors, which we can provide as CSV file, and then also information about the icon grid. These are the inputs. Then EMIPROC takes these inputs and produces all the output. As an output, the input files required by OEM. So it produces new netCDF files with sector-specific emissions, temporal profiles, and vertical profiles. In order to allow a tracer simulated in ICON, or to tell a tracer simulated in ICON that it should receive emissions through the OEM tool, we have to include in the tracer XML file some additional tags, which all have the names OEM type, OEM T-scale, OEM CAT, OEM TP, and VP. So OEM type says that this tracer should be treated as an emission tracer, so it should see emissions. We apply temporal scaling of type 1, because we can apply either hour of day, day of week, month of year scaling, or we can apply just hour of year scaling, so in which case we provide a temporal scaling factor for each single hour of the year. But in this case, here we select number 1, so it would kind of repeat the same hour of day, day of week cycles over and over again. And then we need to apply to tell which emission categories contribute to that tracer. So our tracer here is called NH3, so ammonia, and we have emission categories A, B, C, D. These are just describing emissions from industry, from the C is from residential heating, F is from traffic, and so on. They can have any names, but the names must be the same as those in the output of the EMIPROC tool. And then for each of these categories, we also need to provide information about which kind of temporal scaling factors it should apply, and also which kind of vertical scaling it should apply. And we have in the EMIPROC output files vertical scaling factors, for instance, for GNFR-A, which describes vertical profiles from power plant emissions. So those emissions occur at higher altitude than just at the surface, for instance. Yeah, and so then the last part of this introduction, I want to briefly introduce the chemistry scheme. So that's the second thing. You will deal in the exercise with emissions, and then the second part also with running a full chemistry simulation. What we have prepared for you is simulations with the Mozart 4 chemistry scheme. That's a relatively comprehensive scheme with 85 different gas phase species, 157 gas phase reactions, and 39 photolysis reactions, which are described in this publication. And we also have implemented a newer scheme, even more extensive than this one. But here in the exercise, we will use Mozart 4. To prepare ICANN for using such a chemistry scheme, we need to go through this process that is illustrated here. So ICANN allows you to incorporate any chemistry scheme into the model using the MECA tool. The MECA tool was developed at Max Planck Institute in Mainz. It takes a set of input files describing different gas phase chemistry equations, the gas phase species, and then also a batch file describing actually which of those reactions you want to have. The MECA produces then two output files, the MECA equations, so that's the chemical reaction equations, and the species involved in the scheme. This is then taken by another processor, which is called the KPP, which is the kinetic preprocessor. This preprocessor generates actually a Fortran routine. It can also produce other C and MATLAB code, I believe, but here we use the backend for Fortran. So it generates the code that allows you to actually numerically solve these chemistry equations which were described here. This Fortran code is very close to what we need in ICANN, but not fully. So there's another pre-processing step that converts this output file into a Fortran routine that is consistent with the data formats or the data structures of ICANN. And it also generates an XML file for all the chemical species included in this scheme. And here again, so we go back to this XML file describing our chemical species. We now have again our ammonia species. I mentioned before the tags that are added for the OEM scheme, but now for MECA, we need some additional tags, which are these red ones here. So we need for each chemical species provide its molecular weight. We need to tell how it should be solved, the chemistry should be solved. So, and here we just enter MECA. So that means that this species is included in the chemistry scheme of MECA. And it receives a unique number. Each species has just a unique number. And then also which advection scheme is used for the advection of that tracer. And then I think that's the last slide here as an introduction. So if the tracer is a tracer that also needs to see emissions from biogenic emissions introduced through the MEGAN scheme. There's an additional line or tag which is called emis online bio. And actually, yeah, our example here is a terpene species emitted by plants, and to be able to emit that species through the mechanism, we need to introduce that last line. And so that's basically, in a nutshell, what is the background of this exercise. So you will deal with emission inputs and then also with a full chemistry simulation with the Mozart 4 chemistry scheme, with the right XML files and so on. So that's all.